All right. Now it's part three of the discussion of evidence. We can get into what kind of research you should be looking for, what kinds of information and evidence will be useful into your speeches, and of course later in life in any other speeches you might end up giving. Now, one of the most common kinds of information that you'll be looking for is statistics. That's because statistics tend to be really valuable for both kinds of speeches. In informative speeches, statistics found the foundation of any issue we're trying to learn about. We want to know how many, how much, how often. And when we're being persuaded, we often need to factor in things like cost and value, and that can often be broken down into statistics as well. So the definition, of course, is anything that's numerical, facts and figures that have been systematically collected. That systematic collection is the key issue. It can't just be something that you've guessed at or thrown together willy-nilly. It has to be something that you've actually studied in order to get those statistics together. The most common examples are things like currency, percentages and ratios, even things such as simple counting. I've put up there a baseball card, which baseball cards always have the statistics for each of the players indicating how many games they played, how many times they were at bat, what their batting average was, and so on and so forth. Any of you who are fans of any sport are probably also pretty conversant in the statistics that go along with it. Baseball, for example, got so famous about statistics because they actually started to figure out that you could build a good team by focusing on the numbers. In the book Moneyball, which is based on the true story of one of the first companies that started doing this. Pretty much every baseball team now has people who focus on the statistics of the game. So simply counting things, collecting ideas, comparing them to another, all in numerical form, are statistics. Now remember, in this set of lectures, we're looking at not just what are they, but what are they good for and bad for. So let's move on to those. The benefits of statistics are, first, that they're really concrete. Because we all use the same number system based off of the fact that we've got 10 fingers, the digital approach means that anytime you say a number, I know what you mean. It's very clear. There isn't any wiggle room. Some of you, I'm willing to bet, had trouble on parts of the SATs or any other standardized test when it asked you a question about language. When it said, exorbitant is to expensive as something else is to something else. And in your mind, the words exorbitant and expensive are related, but they're not perfectly connected. Whereas if I say 2 and you say 3, anybody who's watching knows that 3 is more than 2. The relationship is clear and concrete. Additionally, they're easy to present and they make really good visual aids. It's easy to turn numbers into pictures through the form of charts and graphs and diagrams, or even simply showing us what the number is. They translate very well into a visual format. They're also really easy to find, because most research you do will probably include some statistics along with it. So many reports will begin by telling you how much something cost, when something happened, how many people were affected. So those numbers are often a key part of any research you'll find. Finally, they're really logically powerful. It's hard to argue with numbers. Basic rules of math say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and anybody who tries to prove otherwise, with the exception, of course, of goofing around with base number systems and stuff like that, will find it really hard to argue uphill. So numbers are very logically powerful because they're so concrete. The downsides of statistics are many. First and foremost, they are boring. If you're not somebody who enjoys mathematics, you probably are the opposite of somebody who enjoys mathematics. You probably hate them or are immediately turned off by them. It's the kind of thing that immediately tunes you out. Well, I'm willing to bet that many of you have suffered through a math class instead of taking it. And that probably wasn't the teacher's fault. It was more likely that you just simply hadn't developed a love of math. And if you didn't, that means any statistics that we fire at you are probably going to bore you more than they're going to persuade you. Another common problem is that they tend to not have much emotion. That is, they're cold. When we say that 3,000 people died on September 11th, 2001, that number is really easy to say, but it doesn't communicate exactly what that means, that 3,000 people's lives ended on that day. So the number is quick and simple to state, but the emotion is nowhere to be found. So numbers can be really cold. They're also open to interpretation or presentation bias. Like in the pregnancy rate example I showed you in a previous video, when I present a number, it could be misleading, or different people might have different feelings about different numbers. Here's an example. Let's suppose we look at these two numbers. Which is bigger? That's easy. 20% is bigger than 1%. But we have to know what their percentages of. Let's suppose that we're talking about tax cuts. Let's suppose that the rich people, that is somebody who would pay about $1 million in taxes in a given year, are going to get a 1% tax cut, and poor people who would only pay about $400 in taxes in a year would get a 20% tax cut. Now who's getting a better deal? Don't worry, I did the math for you. This person saves $10,000. That person saves $80. That's obvious. $10,000 is more than $80. But think more about this. For somebody who is spending $1 million in taxes, $10,000 isn't going to make that much of a difference. It's not exactly the kind of money you'd find in his couch, but it is still pretty small compared to the total amount of money he or she makes in a given year. Whereas somebody who's only paying $400 in taxes probably is going to notice that $80 difference, because $80 is being able to fill up your gas, 3-4 times. So that's going to be different depending on who the perspective is we're talking about. That's why they're open to interpretation bias. And finally, they can be confusing. Things like story problems, a train leaves Chicago going 40 miles an hour, or even tax forms can be really confusing, and that tends to also make people tune out when they hear too many numbers. My advice when you use statistics is make sure you use them sparingly, make sure that they matter, and be really, really clear about when you use them and when you don't. When in doubt, use them as rarely as possible, but only for key foundational arguments. Now the next kind of evidence are example evidence. These are basically narrative proof, so it relates back to our chapter on narratives. It's reports and descriptions, things like eyewitness accounts, or people telling the story of what they believe might have happened or created a theory of a story. Some examples of these would be brief examples. That's where you use the example only at one point during the talk. Most of the examples that I've used in these lectures so far have been brief examples. I referenced them only one time. But I have used one or two extended examples. For example, I've used the pregnancy example twice now, and I've also used the frog and the scorpion example twice. So those were extended. Now, if I wanted to, I could make the entire class keep coming back to one or more of those examples, but there's really no reason to do it. So extended examples tend to work only if you've got a key reason to keep going back to an example over and over and over again. Now, the weirdest kind of example is the one you've probably heard an awful lot of. It's called a hypothetical example. It means that the example didn't happen, but you present it so the audience can think about it. It usually goes along the lines of, imagine if, or what would you do if you were put into this particular situation? It's not that the example really occurred, it's that you're trying to make the audience think through that story and think through the logic of it. When people make up laws or policies, one of the first things they'll do when they're criticizing their own work is they'll say, but what if this situation occurs? Those hypothetical examples are useful for walking people through your ideas. What are the benefits of examples? They appeal to pathos because they personify the situation. Remember those 3,000 people who died on September 11th. Simply giving you that number isn't very emotionally powerful. But if I walked you through one person's life up until the moment of that disaster, it probably would have much more impact than simply saying the number 3,000. So making a single person's life matter to you is probably going to have a bigger emotional impact than 3,000 people when the cold statistic is presented. They also hold your attention. Once we start a story, as we mentioned in the narrative chapter, audiences tend to tune in, and that's also why it encourages them to retain information. They're more likely to remember information that is put into a story-based format. But there are downsides for narrative evidence. First, they're logically limited by number, meaning that when you present a story, you're almost always presenting only one specific unusual case. And that means it's really easy for anybody to discount your argument by saying, yeah, it happened one time, but if it doesn't happen a lot of the time, we don't need to make a change because of it. It's also logically limited because of comparison. If you present your example, I can present mine, and what does that leave us at? So in my own life, for example, on the topic of smoking or healthy lifestyle, I've known several people who have lived to be really, really old, 80s and 90s, even though they smoke all the time. And I also had the sad experience of having a track coach who dropped dead in someone's driveway on his morning jog when he was only, I believe, just turning 40. That guy had never smoked, ate really well, and exercised all the time. Now, I'll give you a 90-year-old who smokes and a 40-year-old who jogs. Have we really proven which lifestyle is better than the other? We haven't. All we've done is presented some people's stories. And finally, as we mentioned back in the narrative chapter, there are artistic concerns. When you're giving a speech and you stop the speech to tell a story, you've got to make really good decisions about how much or how little you tell us. If you tell us too much, it distracts from the story, from the speech. If you tell us too little, the story won't make any sense and therefore will hurt the speech. Now the reason the header here says examples continued is that there's a specific kind of example that people tend to use that warrants its own discussion, and those are analogies. Analogies are examples that are used for literal or figurative comparison from the current situation. What this means is that when you're talking about one case, you might refer to other cases in order to compare the two. Now the two that are listed there are literal analogies, which is when you compare two things or situations that are of the same class, meaning they're the same kind of thing. Comparing a president to a president, comparing a car to another car. But there's also figurative analogies, which is when you compare two things that are not of the same but share some quality. So the Triple Crown race that just happened this year, I remember my dad talking about the Triple Crown races that he followed back when he was a kid. And in particular, Secretariat was a horse that won by so much that it was ridiculous. The horse was always referred to almost as if it was a machine, how he was chugging down the track and he had a big head of steam. All of those references are figurative analogies indicating that the horse was mechanical or like a train. Right? So to be really clear, here's an example of both a literal and then a figurative analogy. If I compared a football player from one team to a football player from another team at the same age, in the same kind of region, from the same kind of schools, those would be great literal analogies. We're actually comparing two very similar things. But if I compare the first guy with a tank, now I'm engaging in a figurative analogy, either because he can go through stuff without stopping, or he can take a lot of damage, or he's got a really big cannon of an arm, right? That's a figurative analogy. That's where we get the phrase figure of speech. It's somewhat related. Now, what are the benefits for each? For literal analogies, you get all the same benefits of examples, so repeat them from the previous section, but you get a couple specific ones. First, you get the benefit of arguing from precedent, and this is what the Supreme Court does when they review decisions. This is what a lot of legal cases and most people's standards of fair justice go by. The idea is that if we've looked at a case like this before and made a decision on it, then the decisions that go forward in the future should be made by the same rules. That's a precedent. This also invites the idea of a fair comparison. That if I compare a football player to a basketball player, that's unfair. They do different kinds of jobs. They have different responsibilities. But if I compare two football players, that makes more sense. The benefits of figurative analogies, again, include all the same benefits of examples with the following additions. There's the enhanced emotion and memory because they're more emotional, there's more pathos involved. If I can say that somebody was slimier than a snake, or if I can say that somebody slithered into the room, that's going to stick in your mind as an emotional association, and you're more likely to remember it. My dad uses lots and lots of analogies when he talks, and I always get a kick out of them. One that I remember that made me laugh so hard when I was a kid was he said that somebody was making a lot of noise, and he said they were noisier than two skeletons wrestling on a tin roof during a hailstorm. That stuck with me, right? That's an emotional and memorable kind of image. They're also useful logically because they can sometimes be used to make tough concepts easier to understand by whittling them down. Any of you who are fans of the old TV show Schoolhouse Rock have seen tons of these analogies because they would often use them to express difficult concepts. This image is from their episode about the nervous system, and it was called Telegraph Line. The idea was that your nervous system was like a telegraph line, sending electrical signals throughout your body. that analogy is pretty powerful and makes a lot of sense to some people. But there are disadvantages as well. Again, for literal analogies, cross-apply all the same disadvantages of examples. But also realize that no two situations are exactly alike. Even if I compare two presidents, we can't really compare their process because they were different. They existed at different times. A lot of people point to Abraham Lincoln as being one of our best presidents ever because of what he lived through and what he helped the country get through. And we've had other presidents who are not considered to be very good. But it's entirely possible that some of those presidents might have handled the Civil War well as well. And it's also possible that Abe Lincoln might have handled other eras in history really badly. Say, for example, if Abraham Lincoln were alive today, who knows how he would handle the idea of nuclear weapons? So it's really hard to compare two situations because they're always going to be a little bit different. There's also a problem that it tends to grind the debate down, where now people will start arguing about the kind of thing that I just said a moment ago instead of arguing about the real point you're here to discuss. So if you're trying to argue about Michael Jordan versus Scottie Pippen, and then the discussion degrades down to what the game was like and what the region was like when they played and what their positions were and stuff like that, you're getting really far away from the original point you were trying to speak about. On the figurative side, once again, you're going to get all the same disadvantages of examples, plus they can overwhelm the speech. Just like a really good visual aid can overwhelm a speaker, a really good figurative analogy is so interesting and hilarious or persuasive or emotional that it sometimes short circuits the audience and they think about nothing but that for a little while. A famous speaker who ran for president back in 1992, Ross Perot, used these all the time. And they were really memorable and they make great sound bites, but as a result, people didn't pay a lot of attention to the rest of what he said. They can also confuse people because that digesting of difficult concepts could end up oversimplifying them. So the telegraph line example I gave you in the last slide is useful in that it gives you the idea that information travels from your foot to your brain to let you know that your foot's asleep, but it's not really going along an electrical signal line just like a telegraph. It's not encoded the same way, it isn't received the same way, and think about how somebody would react after hearing that your body's made up of this electrical system when somebody gets jump-started by the CPR machine, right? It's going to confuse people and they're going to get stuck to old ideas that are incorrect. They could even trap you. If you end up giving us a persuasive enough figure and analogy, we'll stick with it, even if it's incorrect. And now you're stuck having to explain why your own argument was incorrect. So if you say that if you persuade us that somebody is as bad as a snake, and then later on have to say, oh no, we can make a deal with him, it's going to be hard for you to explain why the snake is now trustworthy. So you got to be careful about using these unless you really need it and unless you know exactly what you're going to use it for in the future. Another piece of evidence is called testimony, and I'm sure you've heard of this before, but there are some things you need to think about it as to what testimony really is. Testimony is opinion as to fact, meaning that you're using somebody else to explain why something is or isn't true. Now, some examples of this would be peer testimony. That's by somebody who doesn't have any special knowledge or expertise. It's just a regular person. We would prefer to have expert testimony. That's somebody who's got special knowledge, expertise, and or experience. That doesn't mean they have to have a PhD. It just means they have to have a reason that we should think that their understanding of the situation is better than the average person's. For example, an eyewitness might have no special expertise, but because they were there and we weren't, their information is now more interesting to us and somewhat more persuasive. The final kind is an unusual kind, which is reluctant testimony. That's when somebody's testimony runs opposite or counter to what you think they would normally say. For example, back in the 90s, we closed several military bases after the first Gulf War. And most people's attitude, especially if you were connected to the military, was that we need as many bases as we could possibly have. So when General Colin Powell, who is very well respected both inside and outside the military community, actually went on the tour around the country explaining why some of the bases are being closed, it was persuasive. Because our idea was, here's a general. If he tells us that we don't need a military base, That's pretty persuasive because we would expect him to say that we need many, many more military bases. So the fact that his argument was the opposite of our expectation was what made it persuasive. Here are the benefits of testimony. The first is that it's ready-made research. Why reinvent the wheel? If you can find out that somebody else has done all of the research on the topic and has already come to a good conclusion, and you trust them, then that's a good way to go. Now the key there is that last part. Do you actually trust the source that you're using for research? If you trust them and it turns out you're wrong, then we aren't going to trust you. So make sure you choose sources that are credible and competent. It's going to dramatically enhance your ethos because it's going to be clear that you did your homework. If you did your homework, it makes it clear to us that you care about the topic and you're competent enough to actually do some research. Many of you, when you get out into the workforce, are actually going to be probably better prepared than some of the people you're working for. But because you just got out of college and are only 20-some years old, here's what they're going to think of you when you come into the first meeting. They're going to see a little kid who needs a lollipop. If you do your research to back up your good ideas, then they're less likely to see your age as a factor. And instead, they'll look past that to the information and the analysis that you're showing by doing some good research. So research is incredibly powerful. Later on, when you say things after having established your ethos, you might not need as much research because they'll begin to expect that you've already done your homework. Now there are some disadvantages. Just because somebody has a title doesn't mean they actually have expertise. For example, if somebody graduates dead last in their class in medical school, just barely skates through, that person is called a doctor. So just because doctor is in front of their name doesn't mean they're actually any good at what they do. Similarly, somebody at the top of their class might not actually be very good at their job. They might be good at the book learning side of things, but not as good at the application side of things. So in that case, I would almost rather have a doctor who wasn't necessarily the top of his or her class, instead somebody who'd done the particular surgery I need many, many, many times. The longer he or she has done it, the more likely it is to show that I'm actually going to trust that person with my life. So a good example of a bad doctor would be this guy. Now this is an actor named Ben Stein, and he's famous for, in many other things, the professor in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. He's a guy who clearly doesn't care about the people he's talking to as he lists off the attendance. He's clearly not very engaged as he asks questions, and we see many comical takes of the audience just being completely bored. That's because some experts might talk over us. That means they say phrases and words and ideas that they expect that we'll know, but we don't, and that confuses us. Or they'll think that we're so stupid that they'll treat us like children. And either one of those can be really bad on the ethos side of things. Either they'll be confusing or they'll be condescending. He tended to be both. The interesting thing is that this particular actor is actually a pretty strong expert when it comes to political and economic affairs. He's actually worked in several government posts under both Republican and Democratic leadership. So in real life, he's actually a pretty good expert. But as an actor playing a professor, he's boring and confusing. Another problem you'll also have is that specialization can sometimes cause bias. Now the reason I left Ben Stein up here is that because he's so big into economics, he tends to prefer business solutions. That means that even though there might be other good solutions out there, because he's an expert in economics, he's going to first think about business solutions. Let's get away from Ben for a second and give a different example, a little more recent. Hopefully this isn't too old of a reference for some of you, but the TV show Scrubs often had a conflict between our two buddies here, Turk and JD, because Turk was a surgeon and JD was a general practitioner. Surgeons become so specialized in performing surgery that they know solutions to many health problems that are surgical, meaning I'm gonna cut you open to fix a particular problem. On the flip side, general practitioners are often more well versed in lifestyle or medications that could actually help somebody with their problem. Now both could be right, but because of their specialization, either as a surgeon or a GP, they're going to emphasize their own guesses first and doubt that the other one is right. So just because you're specialized might actually make you a little biased. And that bias isn't that you're a bad person or trying to skew the audience or corrupt us in some way. It just means that you're unaware of other stuff because you focus so much on your own thing. It's like having blinders to the rest of the world. So when you use evidence, first and foremost look for competent, well-respected evidence that has a good track record. So, now we've gotten through this chunk of the lectures, we've covered the kinds of evidence, and we've covered the pastaya. Remember, different types of evidence have different uses, and that's what I'm going to be looking at when I grade your speeches. So I'm looking for evidence that's clear, concise, well-researched, and well-respected. Don't forget to think about the pastaya as you choose your evidence. Think about things like the logical content, which is logos, the emotional content, pathos, and also your own appeals that you can use either by doing good research or simply by how you present your own speaker credibility statements. So, only one step of this process left, and that's coming up next, which is how to test evidence. That section, part 4 of this lecture series, is going to be what the quiz focuses on. But the rest of these checks of evidence are going to be important because you're going to need to know what they are in order for the quiz questions to make sense. In short, part 4 is the primary focus, but every section so far, as well as the chapter reading, are going to go into that quiz.